Hi there. How many in your party? Right this way. We'll put you at the chef's table. Enjoy.
Hello there.
Well, hello.
Welcome to A Minor Diner, where we take a recent music release, give it a theme, and pair it with two other works of art to create a three-course meal. We've got an appetizer, an entree, and a dessert to make our meal du mois, our meal of the month. I am your treble chef, Jesse, and beside me is your bass chef, Zach.
And gosh, I am just so glad you're here with us.
Absolutely. I actually, first off, have a question for the diners. Does anyone know where I can put a bunch of dirt? I was just dumping it on the street, but apparently the bureaucracy...
No. What is this? You are always dirty now.
It's none of your business.
It literally is. You're in the wine cellar all the time, bringing up buckets of dirt, tracking it through the kitchens, out the front door, in front of the diners.
Yeah, well, maybe one of them can tell me where else to take it.
Take it through the back door. You don't take it through the kitchen. Hell, not out of the earth. What are you mining down there?
I'm not mining anything other than my own business, like you should.
It's minding your own business, not mining.
Besides, what difference does it make where the dirt is?
Because we have an image to uphold, Jesse.
Ah, there it is. What other people think. So all of a sudden, if one of two of the best chefs in this place has dirt on his rosy little cheeks, then all of a sudden he must be... No, I decide what I am. I define what I am. I sculpt from within my identity, my selfhood, my singularity.
Oh, you haven't just been digging through the dirt, but the thesaurus too, huh? But you raise an interesting concept, actually close to this month's meal theme, defining lines.
We all define ourselves in different ways, whether you think of yourself as a Republican or an artist or the King of Sweden. But how many of those lines are necessary to define, and how many of them are completely arbitrary?
We were inspired this month by the first mixtape by English art pop / R&B artist FKA Twigs, entitled Caprisongs. We've paired this cheesecake platter mixtape with a 2003 science fiction film sequel and a 1936 Spanish sculpture. Coming to the table right now, we have our appetizer. All right, I'm going to start things off for our appetizer here because we are talking about an artist that I have a long and cherished past with, I guess, a lot of memories. FKA Twigs, I first got into when she was relatively new on the scene. I happened to stumble upon, for some reason, the music video for a song called Water Me, which was on her second EP. And the music video is basically just her, but her, as she's singing the song, her face is continually like sort of morphing in very vague ways. So her eyes are just kind of out of proportion and her neck is kind of out of proportion, and like paired with the just exquisitely like fantastic beauty of that song, because I think it's just absolutely gorgeous, like one of my favorite songs of all time, if we're being completely honest. It just like struck me right off the bat. In a way that few artists really do. So I got quickly obsessed with her. I got the chance to see her back in 2014. It was one of her first shows in America.
Wow.
She didn't even have her first album out. And I remember the live review that I wrote after the performance ends with the words, FKA Twigs is going to be huge and she deserves it. And I'm glad I wasn't wrong there, because that performance, absolutely jaw-dropping. It's like a small venue in Chicago. And as soon as she comes out, there's like, because like normally if you're at a show, like cell phones kind of annoy me, like people taking camera phone pictures. But
Yeah.
it was like such a barrage of cell phones for the first 10 minutes of the set that like honestly, more than I've ever seen at any show before or after. Like, it felt like this actual moment in a way that very few shows do. She was pitch perfect. Her dancing was exquisite. It was just like magnetic. I saw her again a few years later and she was still great, but like nothing can ever really compare to that first time for me. LP1, her first album, was my album of the year in 2014. Magdalene, her second album, was my album of the year in 2019. So we're talking about a person that I love her to death.
A heavy hitter, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Like top 10, top 5 artists of the 2010s for me. So obviously I was incredibly super excited to hear that she would have a new release coming out. But yes, halfway through January 2022, we've got Caprisongs, which she has released as a mixtape. The first time that she has released something in that form instead of calling it an album.
Yeah, and this is one of those interesting trappings of the 21st century where everything's digital. You'll have artists that put out a whole album in one track. It's just one big 50-minute track. You'll have this collection of 10 songs as an EP, this collection of 10 songs as an album, this
Even
collection
though they're
of
the same length.
yes, and then this one's a mixtape, and this one is a whatever. And so it is an interesting distinction to have a career that's entering its second decade to whatever degree, that this is her first mixtape.
Because mixtapes, you know, I listened to a decent amount of hip hop music in, you know, the first half of the 2010s especially, and that was around the time like Dat Piff was where you got all of your new like rap mixtapes. Yeah. And so somebody like ASAP Rocky would deliver a mixtape, and that would usually mean one of two things, usually both. It would mean either they're new to the scene and this is like their first release, or usually both again, it would mean that they couldn't clear a lot of the samples, like the Odd Future mixtape. When when Odd Future first came onto the scene, their biggest mixtape, Radical, is mostly them rapping over other people's beats, and so they can't make any money off of those without clearing all of this money, clearing all of these samples. So they just release it for free as a mixtape. But now, the mixtape in the sense that I once knew it doesn't really seem to exist to the same degree, just because like everything's on Spotify.
Yeah. It's like almost like it's taken the place of what's that Smiths album? The Louder Than Bombs, where that's like a compilation of B-sides. B-sides only exist because you put out the singles record with something on the other side. And so this album is not an album, and it's not a mixtape. It's a compilation of whatever, whereas that seems to be, I don't want to say what most mixtapes are now, but something like, I can't put a distinct thematic artistic through line through these songs, but it is a collection of songs, and that makes it a mix tape to whatever degree.
And sometimes this is confusing to me. I'm not the world's biggest Drake fan, if we're being completely honest, but
it's very brave of you to reveal that.
Yeah, I know. I make really brave swings on this podcast. But 2015, he puts out I guess a couple mixtapes, because he put out the Drake and Future one, and then he put out If You're Reading This, It's Too Late. That last one, that was about the last good thing that he ever put out. But like, those albums come out the year before Views, which he categorized as an album.
Yeah.
But then like half of the things he puts out are quote-unquote mixtapes, half of them are quote-unquote albums, but all of them sound exactly the fucking same. There's never a through, like a thread through theme in a Drake album. It's just, here's a collection of 19 songs that are Drake songs. And
they're always that. Like, that's the key distinction of like, because I hadn't put that together. If You're Reading This, It's Too Late, and then Views are about the same duration and about the same amount of tracks. And even on a Drake album, for better or worse, like something like Take Care. Take Care has like a point to it,
Totally.
but it has more of a point in the sense of like, oh, I haven't quite heard this at this time, whenever,
Yeah.
2012, I think. And so, yeah, like FKA Twigs, because I remember, because I definitely don't have the same like history with her that you do, but I remember eventually getting around to LP1, and I think it was in 2014, but maybe it was 15, a year after it came out. And it was one of those, like, when you listen to a lot of music or watch a lot of movies or you're engaged in art to whatever degree, when someone says, oh, you got to listen to this, it's both like an endorsement and like a flag of like, I probably don't need to see Spider-Man. I don't think I need, I'm sure it's okay, but it's not like, you know, when that odd person in your friend group says like, oh, you got to see movie X.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that person would
If
not
that-
recommend. Yeah. And so like I was getting a lot of FK Twigs like, oh yeah, you absolutely have to. In the same way like Drake, in the same way like a lot of things. And then you listen to like even, I think it's just called Prologue or whatever the first song is. It's very, very, very different. Like she has such a command over like, this is what R&B is going to be. Because I love R&B, like 90s, 80s, early 2000s R&B. And like it's everything after that kind of sucks. And it's all really bad because all the genre lines are getting too blurred. And then she comes in with this almost operatic, epic, but very subdued, very small, like, or not small, intimate sort of sound. And it blew me away in the same way, like how you start this dish where it's like, okay, when you do something like that, there's a target on your head for your next release and also subsequent releases. Because if you do something impressive, it's expected that you also... your next thing should either be equally impressive or different enough, like, like artistically different enough. And
which is exactly what Magdalene was in 2019. That like it was a step forward in a lot of ways. It's interesting. We can talk about this a little bit more because FKA Twigs herself like despises the term R&B. Like she doesn't think that she makes R&B. We'll talk about that later because I think that's another defining line that we can talk about.
Yeah.
But with Magdalene, a similar sound to LP1, but Magdalene is just like a broken album. Like it is like just dripping with just like really, really real emotions. Like the last track on that album is called Cellophane, and Cellophane is just like potentially the most beautiful song I've ever heard in my life. It's like the first time I heard it, and I've heard it 100 times since it came out. I listen to it all the time, and it's still one of those songs that actually still sends chills down my spine every time I hear it, which again is a rarity. But around the time, so that album comes out in 2019. She gets famous, somewhere around 2014, and that's a relatively long period of time to be
5
without
years.
albums. So she was engaged to Robert Pattinson for a little while before that relationship ended in 2017 after years of racist and sexist online abuse that was coming to her like nonstop from like Twilight fans.
Yeah.
So that happens. In 2017, she has to remove a set of fibroid tumors from her uterus. So that like sets her out, like she can't perform for a little while. Then later, around the time of Magdalene, she files a lawsuit against Shia LaBeouf for sexual battery, assault, infliction of emotional distress in their relationship. And that album, Magdalene, feels like very, very influenced by the turmoil of her personal life around that time. Like, it's not a fun album.
Right.
There's very, very little that's fun about Magdalene, but it's like fantastic, start to finish, except for the song that has Future on it, which is utter fucking garbage, and I wish she hadn't put it on there. But here we are a few years later with Caprisongs, and we're in a completely different headspace entirely, it seems like.
Yeah, this is one of those like, just to be blunt on my side of things, like, this is one of these things that artists do, and I think is a massive casualty of art being not too accessible but too easily distributed. Is a lot of artists do this. I'm going to talk down to artists here for a second, because there's good art and bad art, and are good healthy ways of producing art and sort of selfish ways of producing art. They do this a lot where it's really lazy, where they'll put something out and then defend it with like, well, this is just who I am at the moment. This is where I'm at. This is kind of what's going on in my side of things. And in general, since the start of time to now, especially now where there's 15,000 songs a minute uploaded to Spotify, why am I listening to you? It doesn't need to be that you're the biggest, best, loudest, whatever. It's like, what is you? They put out these statements, and it's like, okay, I don't want that. I don't even remotely care what Shakespeare is doing now.
I don't care who Shakespeare is.
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah. Like, I would want to read a book on Shakespeare's life after being moved by Macbeth or something like that. I don't want this like statement of like, well, just like a temperature check. And this is sort of what this feels like.
Totally.
And again, this is not to limit it to just like mixtapes or artists of this genre or things like today, because Radiohead did that with King of Limbs in 2011 of like, well, this is kind of where we're at. I'm like, well, I kind of waited 4 years for an album, and I'm going to wait another 4 years for an album. I don't care where you are in this particular moment. It's just, she's jumping, and I'll open up this to the resident expert, FK Twigs expert. It's like not her sound. And so it's an unbelievable step down to like, would I like to be in an elevator and hear FKA Twigs as elevator music? Sure. But I also think it's insanely beneath her. And it just feels, I don't want to say noise because that's insulting, but like cardboard of like, it's nice. It's a nice facade. FKA Twigs doing music that's really hard to decipher from other music.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I thought of LP1 when it came out, because there was a lot of this style of music that was kind of coming out around that time. The term alternative R&B was thrown around a lot around the mid 2010s, which was basically like, oh, well, this is R&B music, but it's kind of wacky, like it's kind of bizarre. And I thought that first album that she created was literally like the perfection, like the apex of that sound, to the point where like a lot of people got really into like SZA or like Tinashe like afterwards. And I just could never really get into it because it just felt like a lesser version of LP1 to me. Like I know they were different sounds to a certain sense, but like for me personally, LP1 was like the perfection of that sound, and therefore it almost didn't even need to exist after that to me.
Yeah.
Which again is just a personal statement, but to go from that to this, which feels trend chasing in a sense, is kind of a disappointment. I'm not gonna lie. And I don't know. It's hard. Like it's one of those albums that almost feels like, if you're just gonna talk down about it and like trash it to a certain extent, like it's almost like, oh, you can't have fun. Like you're a very unfun person, because it's like when she put it out, she released a statement that was basically like, after I put out Magdalene, I literally thought I was done making music because I could not have fun doing it anymore. Like it was not enjoyable to me, and so I thought that would be the last thing that I ever came out with. And then this has me in such of a positive mind space, and I'm having so much fun doing this and having fun making music for the first time in, however many years. I'm super excited to release this album and everything. And so me not really liking it feels like I don't know. It feels hard for me because it's like, no, this isn't particularly my thing outside of like a few songs. There's a few really good songs on it. But if she's happy and enjoying herself making music for the first time since making EPs, like, it doesn't really matter if it fits into the category that I've pinned her into. Like, it's still good music. People are still going to like it. But I don't know. It still kind of disappoints me.
Yeah, and that's a weird, because I think that's the weird space that exists now that we're still trying to figure out. Because as with anything, the last like 20 years has been just basically wipe the slate clean every year with every cultural expectation you have of everything. And so you feel this weird guilt because it's like, well, I don't like this, but you're happy about it. Like, you're happy about making this, but I don't like this. Whereas I think like there's a certain level of brutality that comes with it, of like, you FK Twigs are not Caprisongs. Like, you're a human being that is your own whatever. This is something that you've crafted out of whatever, and you've put your heart and soul into it. I don't like this. That isn't a reflection of you as an artist necessarily, or whatever. And I think I don't want to use that word again. The tricky thing is, I don't think we would have known this if it was a different period of history. Like, there's famously people who absolutely adored the Beach Boys probably knew that Brian Wilson was going through things and the brothers were going through all this trouble. But the music is like so literally perfect compositionally and everything, and it's all happy, bubbly, whatever, that it sort of stands on its own and also has a new dimension to it later when you learn the darkness to it. What I'm getting at is, like, it's very bad to perpetuate that stereotype of like you have to suffer for your art and you have to be miserable. But then this is one of those things where the happiest artist ever could be in some coffee shop singing this song on an acoustic guitar, and they're smiling the whole time because they're having such a great time. That song is still allowed to just be god awful trash nonsense. Like, it can still be bad. In the same way that I think there's, you usually get this with like horror directors, of like, they're bright, happy, smiling people in the interviews of like, what kind of twisted, demented mind, like what kind of darkness were you going through? And it's like, well, I just thought like a spider would be cool if it had teeth. And like they're like a little kid or whatever. And so when I hear these things, like, I'm happy to be making music for the first time, it's like, okay, smart on you to call this a mixtape, because then we don't have to like pin this to your
There's no
legacy.
pressure here. We're just kind of seeing what happens.
Yeah, but then it is also like, okay, so then why not just put out, like, do a song a month and just like happy-go-lucky, like whatever, nothing means anything. Then, like, I do admire her for that 5-year gap between like, let me hit a home run. Okay, when are you coming back? When are you coming back? And she just doesn't for a half decade. Comes back again, is like, I'm FK Twigs, like, don't forget it.
Yeah.
This is like, because the one thing, this arrives here at the diner. I look at the track list and it's Tears in the Club featuring The Weeknd. And it's FK Twigs and The Weeknd, Tears in the Club. And I look at that and I get this sound in my head. And I'm like, okay, that's going to be what that song probably sounds like.
And it sounds exactly.
Yes, because like 85% of the time I'm not accurate with that. Of like, this artist featuring this artist and it's this or whatever. It's like, oh, how fresh, how exciting. They did so, like Silk Sonic was basically. Like, oh, that's pretty different. But this was like, I feel like I heard this 8 years ago. Like, what is going on here?
Totally. Yeah, I don't know. It's because I understand why she didn't just release, because she's done it before. In 2016, so 2015 she releases an EP called Melissa, which is just fucking fantastic as well. And then the next year she puts out a single called Good to Love, which is like a really pretty generic R&B song that is fine. Like, it's completely forgettable. But it's just like a single, Yeah. I want to put this out, whatever. Here we go. Caprisongs is, in some sense, an album. Like, it flows relatively well. There are themes that are repeated throughout. Like, it all makes sense together, basically. It's kind of... it goes between different genres. Like, it doesn't stick in one sound, but it all flows relatively well. Like, it all kind of makes sense together. So I understand why she didn't just release this as a collection of singles. But God, there are just some really not very good songs on here.
Yeah, and that's, like you say, you don't think about that. I just discovered this jazz artist from the 40s, and he's been dead for 30 years, and his family doesn't care or whatever. I like it, or I don't like it, or whatever, and it's just this special relationship you have as an individual, or whatever. And then it's like, well, okay, but they're saying this on her Instagram feed. And it's like, I don't care enough about that, but enough people do care about that, that she cares about that, that then her work is going to reflect what people care about. Because what is her issue with being called R&B? Like, what is her...
So basically, when she was first getting started, right? So she put out an EP and she released... the first EP that she put out, which was just called EP, basically she released it. She had a series of videos behind it, but there was no like face behind it. She did the kind of like faceless producer kind of deal where it was essentially anonymous. And she says that this is an interview shortly after her first album comes out. She says that she really feels that her music is only called R&B because she's mixed race. So she says, when I first released music and no one knew what I looked like, I would read comments like, I've never heard anything like this before. It's not in a genre. And then my picture came out 6 months later. Now I'm an R&B singer.
I don't want to disagree with her own personal experience, but this is like the perfect time to like, this is... defining lines. This is the meal, because that is a very, very interesting thing.
Because it's an interesting defining line, because when you listen to because there are songs like, so on LP1, like the first single is called 2 Weeks.
Yeah,
2 Weeks is an R&B song.
Yeah,
it's artsy. There's some really different things going on and some really cool production techniques. But it is an R&B song. EP and EP2, I think you could make that argument about. There's not a hell of a lot of R&B in her first couple releases.
And this is a weird, because this is like an absolute minefield to talk about, but it feels like, because you are allowed to have a spectrum of opinions on things. So what I'm about to say is not my entire extent of my opinion on this subject.
I'm already booing.
Yes, but it's like, it's this weird identity politics, intersectionality, this entire lens of thinking exists at every point in human history, but it's not the same lens. It's not the same opacity that we're seeing things through at any given time. And so I can understand the argument that if the Beastie Boys never appear on it visually ever, that you might not associate, like, those are 3 white Jewish guys, like, at all, like, because it's hip hop. And so you might not draw that distinction. Like, when I was younger, my parents would listen to The Doors, and I always pictured like a Kenny Rogers Santa Claus looking, like, that's definitely a 60-year-old guy, like Jim Morrison. And that, when I learned the truth, it doesn't like quite change. It's not like, oh wow, that's impressive. Then it's just like, oh, okay, I guess that's that. And so I think that's a very tricky, because I think a lot of artists do that, and I think that's something inspired by probably the 90s, when artists really start, Tears for Fears make their music and they kind of stay in their lane in the same way. Even the Beatles sound like the Beatles. I mean, kind of, they get the Indian influence there, but like, it's not until artists like a Radiohead or a Beck or whoever, where I'm like, I'm deliberately going to change genres in the 90s. I don't know if that's like a fair point of, like, I wonder if David Bowie ever got pissed off of, like, it's not glam rock, it's this special word I made up or whatever, because I know artists don't like being defined in that way. But then that's, I guess, the only irony I take, is that I think if, or not irony, but exception I take to her point there, where were this LP1 or Magdalene I would probably subconsciously, emotionally want to defend her of like, yeah, that is definitely a racial thing. That is blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Then you listen to this and it's like...
Caprisongs is like straight down the middle. Like these are like radio pop R&B songs most of the time. There's a lot of I can't reggaeton. I just can't.
No.
And there is some of that. There's like a reggaeton Afrobeat influence on some of the tracks. Which near the middle of the album, like Pappy Bones and like Jealousy, like these are bad songs.
Well, and just to give us a disclaimer, like, you know, the treble and bass chef do not like reggae, like at all. But I think if you were to ask us, like, so what are your thoughts on Bob Marley? It's like, okay, there's a huge division between my personal enjoyment and my artistic respect of his competency and what he's doing.
And even like dub, you know, like a lot of dub I can really respect from a lyrical level. I can really respect on what they're doing. Enjoyment wise, I get no enjoyment out of it whatsoever. And here, I just like on those songs, I don't even think there's anything interesting enough to really say like, oh, well, you know, you don't like this because you don't like reggaeton. Like, well,
yeah, because like in regards to defining lines, this feels like how would you describe pudding or Jello if there were not a container to put it in? Basically, of like it's like a plasma. This is like a very gray cardboard plasma of like, well, you don't like it because of this. It's like I don't even know why I don't like it because it's not anything. It's not really. It sounds like when you have Tears in the Club combined with I can't remember that song you just said towards the end, and all of these sorts of things. It's like I had a weird enjoyment, appreciation / like annoyance with Odd Future when they were doing things, because it's like you guys are just relentless, putting out so many things all the time that are all kind of the same sounding, but it's all like no one else is quite doing it in this way. It's kind of exciting, kind of whatever. Whereas this, it's just like, so what artists would you compare this to? I don't know, like 78 other artists.
Exactly.
Like it's really hard to, when an artist doesn't want to put definition into like what they're doing, it's this weird sort of again, let's get in trouble again, turn the heat up in the kitchen Taylor Swift thing of like people so ardently, like let's talk about brief defining lines. Damon Albarn from Blur and Gorillaz just got in trouble for saying that Taylor Swift doesn't write her own songs. And then she called him out on Twitter, and then he recanted and apologized and everything. And her fans, Taylor Swift's fans, like went above and beyond with this of like, yeah, but you're talking about the greatest living songwriter. And it's like, okay, like you can like an artist, you can like a whatever. What is Taylor Swift? Like she's not, and I'm not saying she has to fall into a genre or this or that. Beyonce has a little bit of armor there where she very clearly makes like genre sort of work. But then you have an artist as multifaceted and multi-talented as the guy that's behind the Gorillaz, basically, where that's constantly evolving and shifting. And then you have a Taylor Swift, and then the outcry over, you know, it wasn't a nice thing to say that she doesn't write her own songs. But also, I, in whatever sort of sense, would also say, yeah, she doesn't, because it's not like a distinct, of course she sits down and literally does them, but it's like in the way that Caprisongs, I worked really hard on these songs, this whole mixtape, and it's like, to what point? What are you trying to say? Because if you're happy making music, do that, but what am I getting out of this exchange?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's there's I don't want to sound overwhelmingly negative on it. I think there are some really fun ones. Despite it sounding very generic, I like Tears in the Club. Meta Angel is a cool song.
Ride the Dragon, I like
Ride
that
the
one.
Dragon is a cool song. Darjeeling is a cool song. There are some cool things happening here. The production is often very good, if not inspired. And it's almost me drawing a defining line myself, that I have a defining line of what FKA Twigs should be and the quality of stuff I know that she is capable of. And because this does not fit the box that I have created for her, I can't get much enjoyment out of it. But that might not be true for you because we all have different defining lines.
And I think what you just said applies a little bit to our entree coming up here. A Minor Diner would be nothing without our sponsors. Do you ever feel like you live such a busy life that you don't have time to be you? Between work and all of the world's demands, are you losing grasp on what makes you, you? Don't worry, we can help. Welcome to Hobbybox. Each month we'll send you a container with all kinds of tools that you can use to build a personality. Whether it's the latest movies and music that you can pretend speak to you individually, bumper stickers that show the world that you understand politics or know the names of brands, or jerseys for this month's winning sports teams, our monthly hobby boxes will break up the monotony of being you. It's tough work having a personality, and we're here to fill that void so that you can fit in. What are you going to do? Die alone? Hobbybox.
Finally, the podcast for you, the 90s kid. We know how much you love the 90s, being someone who was born between the years 1985 and 1996. Wow, being a millennial, am I right? Who could forget the Smashing Pumpkins? We talk your favorite tunes from bands like Nirvana to the Crash Test Dummies. We explore 90s film like Dunstan Checks In and Hellraiser 4 Bloodline. And we get you right back into the 90s state of mind, remembering speeches from Ross Perot and the rooftop Koreans defending their businesses during the 1992 LA riots.
I only have one shotgun, that's all I have.
Times just aren't the same these days, right? Totally whatever. Gen Z just doesn't get it, but you do, because you're a 90s kid. We've got all that and a bag of chips on the 90s Kid podcast. So tell the other podcast to talk to the hand and get jiggy with us, home skillet.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
90s Kid.
All right, so for our entree this month, this is a bit of a... I would never bring this to the restaurant. In my mind, like 6 months ago, if you were to say, like, Jesse, you are going to bring this dish, and it's going to be one that you advocate for and argue for.
No.
Yeah, I would have been like, nah, I think I probably died before that. There's some sort of suicide before I do that. But anyway,
here we are.
Yes, here we are with a pretty weird, meaty, gooey entree for sure. So when I was a teenager, late teen, is when I get my film awakening. The treble chef and bass chef, we have a mutual friend named Josh who got me into movies. And like I owe it to him and his now wife why I'm in the filmmaking industry. And so he was showing me all sorts of movies because I didn't watch too many growing up. I was outside all the time. And so
loser.
Yes, exactly. Basking in the sun, getting my future cancer. But he'd show me like Pulp Fiction and Guy Ritchie movies and this and that. And then we're in film school, first year of film school, first semester. I'm 18, and he's like, "Oh, you've never seen The Matrix before?" And I'm a little like as much as an 18-year-old can be interested in philosophy. So I know about Plato's Cave and Bertrand Russell and very basic elementary things at the top of the iceberg there. And so I watched The Matrix and I'm not into it at all. And like he's kind of surprised by that. I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's cute, but it's like not good at all. And I'm whatever. And then fast forward a couple of years, I meet my dear friend and producing partner and then my cinematographer, and they both have these like childhood histories with The Matrix. And I'm like, "Oh, Jesse, what do you think of The Matrix?" I hate The Matrix. The Matrix sucks. Like, it's not good at all. Like, what are you talking about? And they're kind of surprised by that. It like seems like something you specifically would be really into. And so that persists and persists. And then in 2021, they put out the trailer for The Matrix Resurrections. And I watched it like, I can't wait to hate this or whatever. Yep. And then I was like blown away. I was like, oh, wow, actually this looks like a movie. This looks pretty decent. I like this. And then the second trailer, I was like, oh, wow, I want to know about these characters. I want to know, like, I'm missing something. So I went back and watched The Matrix and was like, oh, this is great. I like this
It's a really good movie.
Yeah, as the dumbest person that to ever live, like, I actually like The Matrix, guys. Rest assured. I've come around on it, world. You can rest easy now. But then I'm like, okay, yeah, let's go to the other ones then and let's see. The Matrix, the first one, is an insane struggle to get that made because the Wachowskis are like trying to explain things that have become so shorthand in culture now. But like bullet time, how the camera would spin around in slow motion, the idea of the Matrix of like, what if life wasn't life and it was in a computer and blah, blah, blah. You're trying to explain this to Warner Brother executives who are like, is there a hot babe in it? Is there an explosion? Is there a whatever?
And these are people, so, they had made one film.
And that film was only because Warner Brothers was basically like, make something else before you make this, because we can't just hand you $70 million and make this. And so they make that movie. Warner's is like, okay, you can make a movie. What is this one? And they, get the script and they don't get it, but they're like, someone else is going to get it and we can't let another studio get it. So they're like, figure this out a little more. So they do a full like graphic novel storyboard of the whole movie. It's like 600, 800 pages. And then they give it to Warner Brothers and they're like, okay, audiences will watch this. This is exciting enough. Give us a test or whatever. And so they shoot the first 5 minutes of the movie, the big exciting Trinity chase thing. And they're like, okay, you can go do it. We'll see how this works. And they try to get all these actors and actresses, don't get anybody that they, their first choices, and then get the team they do, and it all works. And it's all like this culture seismic like shock when that movie comes out. So they get basically a permanent green light. Warner's is like, we doubted you at literally every step of the way. You were historically correct in like an insane way. What do you want to do?
An insane way. I can't like, it's a really good movie. Like the first Matrix is a really good movie, but they're like, it's bizarre that it was as big of a hit as it was.
Yeah. It's like impossible to pitch. It's like, and I'll get into this in terms of defining lines, but it's like an impossible to explain, because that was kind of the recurring joke in 1999 is like, you have to go see The Matrix, and it's like, what's it about? And it's like, well, I can't tell you, and also I don't know. Like it's like hard to comprehend.
Because you're looking at, I pulled up the domestic box office for 1999, and The Matrix was the 5th highest grossing film of the year. And you're looking at, it was bested by like The Phantom Menace and like Austin Powers.
Yeah.
And number 7 on the list is Adam Sandler's Big Daddy.
Yes.
Like people were not any smarter in 1999 than they are today.
No, studios were a little bit smarter, but yes. But yeah, it's like, explain this. There's no IP to it. There's no franchise to it. This big sci-fi action, kung fu, philosophical romance movie. Keanu has been in movies before, but he's certainly not like an A-lister. Carrie-Anne Moss is like a Canadian TV star.
Yeah.
Lawrence Fishburne isn't in his like element at the time. So they make this movie and the studio's like, yeah, whatever you want, literally just like go do it. And so the first Matrix is this very tight and precise, small story. You see a lot and the stakes are high, but the scope of the story is kept pretty small. You have your ragtag team, you have these very simple places. And so normally the filmmakers would accept that the rules of the first film should be the rules of the sequels in terms of like camera language and characters and the size of the story or whatever. But the Wachowskis, for better or worse, did no such thing. They absolutely exploded the size and scope of the world for the sequels, introducing a ton of new characters and environments, and packed it all together in a structure that bears no resemblance to the first one. And so audiences, naturally, had no idea what to make of it. In pop culture, if you say the words The Matrix sequels, it's shorthand for saying that a movie is disappointing, unintelligible, or a franchise killer. Objectively speaking, The Matrix sequels are polarizing at best and basically reviled on average. I, having seen them about 2 months ago for the first time, completely out of that context, I actually don't mind them. And I think what I find fascinating about this second film, Matrix Reloaded, your entree, is that artistically, it's actually perfect in terms of how it defines itself. A movie is a very complicated thing to make because there are so many moving parts and so many people contributing their own flourishes to it. And as a result, most films are very similar and very vague in terms of style. In fact, I'd argue that most master filmmakers are simply very good at taking a particular pre-existing genre or style and just improving it slightly. But The Matrix Reloaded is a sci-fi action, gunslinging, kung fu, cybergoth romance drama about conformity, destiny, free will, aliens, anime, civil rights, environmentalism, the ethics of artificial intelligence, aliens, again, democracy, sexuality, and vampires. And it puts all of this on one plate, and you're like, just on sheer like scope alone, there is no way in hell this can all fit into a 2-hour movie. And even though it's messy, it does. Yes. And so no matter how good or bad The Matrix Reloaded may be is irrelevant. Because in terms of defining lines, I don't think that out of all of the movies that have ever existed, that there is anything quite like this specific one.
Interesting. Because I was, I don't know how much we should go behind the scenes on how we create meals of the month here. But, essentially we get inspired by a release, and then each of us, the base chef and the treble chef, choose one of the other dishes, right? And generally when we have our theme and we have our album and you bring your piece to the table, I know exactly what angle you're going for with it, like why this ties in to whatever we're talking about that month. And FKA Twigs and The Matrix 2, The Matrix Reloaded, I was like, I'm not sure where Jesse's going with this. But honestly, even if I do want to hear more about your the lines we define. But yes, I'd always heard the Matrix sequels talked of like either in a hush, like, oh, we don't talk about the Matrix sequels, or just like with a laugh, like, oh, they're not even worth taking seriously, like they're not worth acknowledging. So I never watched them. I was late to the Matrix too. I didn't watch the first Matrix until I was probably like a freshman in college. Like I just never watched it.
Yeah, likewise.
And then I finally watched it and I was like, oh, this is fantastic. This is very good. I really like this. Even if it is the most like aged late 90s like new metal fucking piece of horse shit on one side. But like I totally agree. This movie's an utter mess. Like it has these like only bested by Christopher Nolan like exposition dumps.
The Architect, yes.
Oh my god. The Architect is at least a decent scene.
Yeah.
But there are these scenes with Morpheus talking for like half an hour. I'm like, god damn. Like get on with it. But then like the whole thing kind of feels to me like this, like it's like a Hollywood film. It's like it's an action film, but it's like this weird, like uncanny valley Hollywood film where like it's all things that you've kind of seen before, but then everything is kind of weird and like the script is wacky. The plot sort of makes sense, and there's so much. The Wachowski sisters bring a lot of personality to this. Like if like a lot of blockbusters I criticize for being like cold and unfeeling and kind of like just motionless slabs, like I don't think of that with Matrix Reloaded. There's a lot going on here, and some of it is really, really cool. But the action scenes are like they straddle this weird line between like awesome and terrible. I think it almost, if we're talking about defining lines, right? Like we've got this idea of what good filmmaking is like, and like what a good film is and what good action is. And I almost think this film like shatters that line entirely. Yeah. Because there's a fight scene with Neo and 10,000 Agent Smiths.
The Burly Brawl, yes.
The Burly Brawl. I had it. So in college, I had this friend who showed me this compilation of moments from this video game called Skate 3.
Oh, yeah.
Skate 3 is like a Tony Hawk's Pro Skater ripoff, like a skateboarding. But the physics engine in Skate 3 is like so fucked up that occasionally like the skateboarder will just like fall through the ground, or they're like trying to do skateboarding tricks and then they just like go off into the ether and like get cut in half, and like the physics go all wonky and do weird shit, and it's hilarious and amazing. The Matrix Reloaded action scenes remind me of that.
Yes. Yeah, there's like, because there's watching it the first time, you know, you're always trying to like wrap your arms around what a work of art is, of like, oh, I kind of got this. And if it's great, it's like a nice hug of like, yeah, because I can fit around this. And every new scene with this one was like, oh, I guess, okay. And you just like keep going wider and wider. And like, because there's the beginning, Trinity does the bike thing, and then
There's the bike thing.
and then she gets shot, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, interesting, it's a dream. And then like the Seraph fight, which is like the complete homage to like Hong Kong martial arts, whatever. It's like, oh, okay, cool, great, this is awesome. And then the Burly Brawl, where it's him with like 10,000 Agent Smiths the whole time, because then he does that move where he pulls the pole out of the concrete and then like puts it down, and then he's running a lot, kicking the Agent Smiths. And I just like the whole time, it's really hard to know what to make of this, because it goes on so long. You're like, what actually are we doing here? I don't remember like what the point is.
Like I don't even know why. Like I feel like I vaguely understood the plot of what was happening here, but like the entire kind of Agent Smith subplot here is almost a mystery to me. Like it all kind of makes sense, but they keep showing up, and there's always 10,000.
Yes. Well, because like that scene, I was like, it just kept ballooning, and I couldn't get my arms around it. But then the thing that did it for me is he takes one Agent Smith and like throws it into the crowd, and when he knocks them over, it makes a bowling pin sound, like he got a strike or whatever.
It's
and
amazing.
I was like, oh, this is a video game. And that was also the moment when I like picked this. I was like, I wonder what Zach is gonna think at the bowling ball moment. But it's like the way in which, because the tricky, all of my like Matrix understanding comes from this writer for The Atlantic, David Sims. He has a podcast where Blank Check, they've talked about it before, and his way of interpreting it. But also there's a movie in between Matrix 1 and 2 called The Animatrix, where it's like, okay, here are the nuts and bolts of literally how all of this works, like digital or computationally, but also philosophically. Yeah. And so when you watch like Matrix 1, Animatrix, Matrix 2, Matrix 3, and Matrix 4, and then like do 30 minutes of research, it's like, oh, this is all very simple. Yeah. But like the problem is it's very simple to write this down. It is incredibly difficult to like actually make a movie out of this. And that's the weird defining line thing. Because I think then you have like the famous sequence I had always heard about forever is that the Matrix team built a highway in the desert so they could shoot this thing. And so I was waiting for the giant highway scene, and it comes, and it's interesting. It's hard to watch.
I don't know where you're going with it. I think because overall I would say I liked The Matrix Reloaded, but it was like I don't know if I would really recommend it in general. No. Like, I don't think it's nearly as bad as people think it is, but like I said, it's a mess of a movie. I had a smile a mile wide, or a mile and a half, which is as much freeway they built to choreograph this scene. Mile and a half wide, that entire fucking scene. It is amazing.
Yes, and it
is utterly bonkers.
And that's the thing. It's like, I don't begrudge anyone who went in 2003 who's like, I just love The Matrix. I sure can't wait to watch this. Because like, I hadn't been exposed to that much at all. Like, I don't really get spoiled with movies or things. Like, I still haven't seen Spider-Man yet, and it's like I barely know anything that happens in that.
The Sam Raimi.
Yes, I haven't seen the third one, so and I don't know anything that happens in it. But like, so I wasn't that privy to so much that happens. But like when they go in, there's the guy they're Merovingian, and the Merovingian is technically like a undead vampire guy that's survived several reboots of The Matrix.
Why he's in the movie, not really sure.
And
just a complete like half an hour that doesn't really need to exist.
Because he's got to protect the keymaker, and why does he?
No, nobody knows.
But like the smile thing is like because it's like that bowling pin moment. Like the defining line is like, this is, if you like sci-fi and kung fu and anime and romance, this is like your movie. Like you should just be enjoying this. It's not here to do whatever. Because like when they go to the Merovingians' lunch restaurant thing, and then they cut to the two white guys with the dreadlocks, I was like, just yes. And then when they're fighting them later or whatever, and then one of them says like, oh, we're not happy, are we? And no, we're not. And they say it in this weird quasi-British Australian accent that's impossible to place. I literally said out loud, like, yes, hell yes, like this is perfect. Like, why do they sound like that? I don't care.
Nobody
I don't
cares.
need, like, it doesn't matter. And then Morpheus has a samurai sword. Where'd he get that? Like,
Doesn't matter.
Just constantly. But like, that's sort of what I mean when it comes to defining lines. I would rather watch this than I think Star Wars prequels, the second one at least, Attack of the Clones.
Attack of the Clones is horrid.
Yeah, whereas this one is like, okay, there's connective tissue to the first thing that we all liked at least.
Yeah.
But like there's this, like my general point here being is that like whether you want to call it America or the art world or the Western world or the world at large, the biggest flaw is not allowing others to actually be who they are. Like we say, like everything constantly right now, art, advertising, corporations, the government, all messages right here in the 2020s are be yourself, contribute, be yourself. But it's always like, so long as you don't disagree with whatever I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like be yourself, be yourself. And so there's this interesting aspect because the Wachowskis had not transitioned at this point. They're transgender. There's this anecdote about the first one. In the first Matrix, there's this character called Switch, and they wanted her to be one gender outside of the Matrix and a different gender in the Matrix. Because you sort of, it's kind of a read between the lines sort of thing. When they go into the Matrix, you're picking your avatar basically.
Yeah.
Like a lot of this again comes from like David Sims, where he explains like the Seraph fight, where like I need to find the Oracle, and then who are you? And he's like, I'm Seraph or whatever. And he's like, okay, so take me to the Oracle. Okay, 1 second, and then they fight.
Yeah.
And then he's like, you never. Okay, sorry, I just had to fight you for a second. Why? You don't know someone unless you fought them. And you're like, what? Okay, sure, whatever. And then David Sims' incredibly eloquent point of like, that's a login screen. Like he needs to go see. Yeah, exactly. That's like the key. Like I heard that the first time. I was like, oh, I like the Matrix movies.
Wow.
These are movies. Yeah. So like you go into the Matrix. Those are essentially your avatars. What you're deciding to dress up as in, or how you see yourself and how you'd prefer yourself to be viewed to the world. And I think at least Lana Wachowski has come out and said like, yeah, they're kind of an allegory for their like a transgender allegory. And I wouldn't give them 100% credibility on that because it's a little bit retrospective of like, if I write something or make some movie 20 years ago and I say, oh, that's because of this. Like famously, Spielberg had a rough relationship with his dad for many years. And that's why in E.T. there's a rough dad, in Jaws there's a rough like these father issues, in Hook, in a lot of things. But then you get a movie like this and it's like you say, it's this behemoth of a Hollywood movie. Okay, so what does a Hollywood movie walk and talk and act like? What function should it serve? And The Matrix is like, the boat floats. It's messy, like you say, and it's a rocky boat or whatever, but it is a boat completely not of anyone else's design other than theirs. Like if you had to describe it, it sounds like you're talking to a 6-year-old, especially the sequels. Like, it's like there's this guy, and then there's this part, and then there's another part, and then there's like a guy with a key, and then like
And there's samurai sword.
and they're fighting on top of the truck.
Yeah, dude, they jump off a bridge onto a motorcycle.
Yes, and the motorcycles are filled with fuel, and like all of these moments that are like, but then there's something about it, because then especially the ending, I don't want to, we can spoil a lot of it, but if you haven't seen it, it's halfway worth watching. I would just say watch the first Matrix, watch the Animatrix, and if you want to stop there, that's a very profound one too. But the ending of the movie, especially because the very last shot is like, I know who that is to whatever degree, but especially like a 2003 audience is like, who's that? What is that? Why is this played as some big dramatic moment? Because it's a bit of a cliffhanger. But like, I think when it comes to defining lines, it's one of these things, because I think in A Minor Diner, I usually come across saying like, oh, this is like, if it failed, it's like, oh, that's rough and that's bad, and like this is a horrible thing that's happened. But it's like, this is such a noble it's like in baseball, this is like the greatest foul ball like ever hit, basically.
Totally,
like,
yeah.
They pitch this insane thing. They give him a 200-mile-an-hour fastball, and they hit it, and it just hits some orphan up in the the rafters or whatever. But just like, they're like, yeah, it just like his head exploded. Like,
It was kind of awesome.
yeah, like it just decapitated him like cleanly. You're like, you gotta respect like that they can swing a bat. Like, that was insane.
I feel like something that we tend to do, especially in the echo chamber of the internet, draw, when it comes to art and movies and everything else, to draw this kind of good bad binary. Like, films are either that's a good film or this is a bad film.
Yeah.
And there's no real in between. Like, I had literally never heard anybody defend The Matrix Reloaded until you defended it to me and then made me watch it. But it was interesting. I lived overseas for a few years, and when you live overseas, especially I was in Vietnam, which is kind of taken out of the, you kind of get taken out of the popular consciousness in a certain extent. Like, it still exists because you're still on the internet and you still keep in touch with people, et cetera, et cetera. But the conversations and the public consciousness is completely different in a country like that. And in my first year that I was over there, that was the year that La La Land was released.
Oh, yeah.
And when La La Land, I don't know how you feel about that film. I quite like it. But when it was first released, I feel like everybody was praising it. Like, best thing since sliced bread, best movie of the year. Oh my fucking God. Like, this is genius, fantastic. And I didn't see it. I didn't see it for months and months and months. And it finally like came out in Vietnam, and I watched it in theaters. And I was like, this is a really, really good movie. I really like this. And then I went on the internet, and now everybody hated it.
Yeah.
By the time I got to see it, like, somebody realized that there was only like one black person in a movie about jazz, which, could conceivably be a problem. But everybody overnight seemed to think like, oh, this is an overrated film. Oh, there's not much there. This is now a bad movie.
Yeah.
You can't like La La Land. We want Moonlight to win.
Yes. Just this wholesale write-off, because it doesn't. And that's the tricky thing with art. It might be more, the smaller the scale of the art, maybe it's more forgivable. But like Damien Chazelle, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He just like comes up with the idea of the movie and just executes the movie. And then he pumps that into a culture that's like, Moonlight is not on his radar. Neither is any other movie that came out that year. He's just dumping something onto the wall there, and I think that happens quite a bit. And so, like, I think that mostly happened here in The Matrix with the rave scene, because there's this moment that happens in like the first 20 minutes, where it's just like 5 minutes of people dancing and gyrating and kind of dry humping on one another. and people are like, what is, like, this is a Matrix movie and I'm only like 15 minutes in, what is going on? 20 years later, me seeing it completely removed from that context as a filmmaker, I thought it was like pretty obvious, where it's like, these people, these are the human beings alive in the real world, not in the Matrix. So they're the sliver of humanity left. They're like celebrating their humanity. And if it's this story about humans versus machines, then we do need to see the defining line between what is human and what is machine. Like, what is the world that we're trying to save here? And so in every other movie, some giant scene where people are gyrating and grinding on one another to some weird tribal techno music would be very overindulgent, hedonistic, and lazy. But this isn't any other movie. This is The Matrix. And so for one of those people that don't know, one of the literal meanings of the word matrix is a pattern of intersecting lines. And so the Matrix films are this confluence of action, philosophy, science fiction, romance, and spirituality that intersect in very odd ways because no one thinks to grab this many defining lines and throw them against one another. The result, no matter how good or bad, is inherently authentic because the Wachowskis didn't let the outside world tell them what a movie is, how a movie should operate, and what a movie should be about. So in this same vein, when it comes to finding those defining lines that exist in you, our dear diners, all of those elements that shoot off in weird directions, don't let anyone tell you that they might be contradictory or weird or awkward, because the combinations of those lines, the point where they intersect, is what makes you you. And sometimes you might be this bizarre early 2000s Hollywood fever dream that lasts over 2 hours, 10 minutes of which is a oily dance scene. But that just means that there's more of you to love. So dance away.
So, to kind of introduce our dessert, we're going to have to go back to 1820, April the 8th, 1820, in the ruins of the ancient city of Milos, which was at this point part of the Ottoman Empire. A peasant named Yorgos Kentrotas, sorry Yorgos if I couldn't pronounce your name correctly, discovered a statue. And the statue is the Venus de Milo. And this is now perhaps the best known, most loved ancient Greek sculpture. They believe that it was carved somewhere 120, 130 BC. Marble statue appears to depict Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty. It was not complete. The arms have been... The arms were not discovered with the rest of the body. But now that famous marble statue is in the Louvre in Paris for all to see. But today we are not talking about the Venus de Milo. We are talking about a later work, the Venus de Milo with drawers.
Ooh, 2.0.
Ooh, 2.0, exactly. Yes. So this is from Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali being probably the foremost name in surrealism. So this was 1936. He was living in Paris at the time that he sculpted this. We're not doing marble anymore. It is a half-size plaster reproduction of the statue, but it's altered. And you can probably guess how it's altered based on the name. It has drawers in the figure's forehead, breasts, stomach, abdomen, and left knee. They have drawers that kind of pop out, and there's even cute little pom-poms decorating each of the drawers.
Fancy.
Had you ever known about this piece before?
No, because like you say, the original Venus statue is the famous one, the woman with her torso and the head and the arms are now lost. Like, everyone's seen it. But I didn't know, like, I wasn't surprised. Like, oh, he sounds like the kind of guy that would do this kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason that I brought it for dessert here, we're pretty stuffed after The Matrix. That was kind of a bloated, bloated film,
stuffed and gassy.
Yeah. So this one's perhaps a little more slight. But the reason I brought it, in terms of defining lines, it's kind of interesting because I'm going to talk about what Mr. Dali's intentions for the piece were. And it was interesting because I chose to bring this for the dessert, and then as I usually do, choose a dessert, and then I want to learn more about it, so I know everything for the patrons when they come in and ask about these desserts, right? And I found that Dali's reading of his own piece was actually radically different from mine.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But my reading being the Venus de Milo, thought to be, this priceless work of art. And I thought the piece was kind of drawing a defining line between like, okay, this art is wonderful. Like it's great, it's classic, but fuck, like it's not really doing anything. It's just sitting here, right? Like it's just sitting in the Louvre. It's not accomplishing anything. So what if we made this art actually functional? What if we fit things inside of it? What if there's drawers? What if it what if it actually serves a damn purpose? And that made me start thinking about like art. If we are to call something art, it almost feels like art is not supposed to have a function. Would you agree, disagree?
No, that's interesting that you bring because almost maybe back in the day, let's say you make a pot or you make a idol for worship or whatever, that is artistically done, but it is something pragmatic. Whereas, I would definitely agree by the early 20th century, it's like if it exists for aesthetic pleasure, it surely serves no actual function in life. That's interesting.
Because it's interesting that you talk about, idols or old cups or whatever. If you go to the British Museum in London and you look at all of these, old artifacts from this culture and that culture that then the British stole,
you sneak that in there.
They weren't thought of as art back in the day, right? Like these people that are making these, cups for people to use, they weren't thought of as artists. They were not worshipped. These were just like fucking things that people used. I'm struggling to think of anything before like quote unquote like Oriental art that was prized as both function and art per se.
Yeah, because it reminds me, I've been talking with this dear friend in China. We talk like once a week, and it usually devolves into this: how you doing? How's it going? How's the playwriting? How's the screenwriting? And then here's
just complaining.
Yeah, here's everything wrong with the world and why World War III is going to start and whatever. But she has an interesting perspective that's like the difference, a little bit of why like Asia has lagged behind, and this isn't 1,000% relevant to your point, but it wraps around to being relevant. The reason why Asia sort of lapsed behind in so much of politics and culture, lapse being a quote unquote word, is because
by the Western way of thinking.
Yeah, is because the Western, like you get the Renaissance and then the Industrial Revolution, kind of this very broad spectrum of time. But there's this emphasis on like realism of like plays are supposed to depict something going on in society, and same with any sort of painting, even if it's surreal or anything. Whereas in the East, it's all incredibly romanticized. That life is not, they're not trying to escape it, but it's like this idealized, mystic perspective of things. And so I think you also see the same thing like in China or Japan, where art is such a beautiful, amazing, wonderful cup that they would use back in 800 BC. And then at some point they just decide this is strictly not functional art whatsoever. It's a silk tapestry that we hang behind the emperor, and that's all it can possibly be. And then I agree in the sense that almost in modern times, it feels like what I'm getting at by bringing that ancient example to then almost contemporary times of defining lines. This feels like a sort of mishmash in like a grotesque way. I think it's beautiful. I think it makes a lot of sense. But in like that, did Cronenberg do The Fly?
Yes.
Yes. So like the mutant trying to like form two things together. This to me like almost feels like the beginning of like minimalism, where people want like, I want a speaker or a Bluetooth, sound system or whatever, but I want it to look good because I'm going to minimally decorate whatever. So it has to look good and function how I want it to. And this feels like a sort of, what would be the polite way to say it? Like the redheaded stepchild of both of those things of like, well, we're artists. And so we like being enlightened, or not artists, art appreciating society. And so the Greco-Roman, whatever, but also, yeah, she's not doing anything. She's not paying rent. So like, I want to put my socks in whatever drawer there on her.
On her bust.
Yes, on her bust. I want to put my socks in there. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I almost view it as this like strange kind of liminal space between like art and function, right? And it's interesting because if you give a famous piece of art like the Venus de Milo a function, like does it actually strip it from its art? Because I think of bougie American dude who has minimalist apartment, like the classic bachelor pad.
Yeah.
But most of the pieces that would be in that, minimalist apartment would be, they'd probably shop at somewhere higher class. Mm-hmm. But I think of IKEA, right? Where the IKEAN, is that a word? IKEAN?
It is now, yeah.
Where the IKEAN products are, I think from a purely visual perspective, pleasant to look at.
Yeah.
They have almost some sort of artistic value, but they're also mass-produced objects. In the same way that, if you buy a reproduction of a painting, from the gift shop of the British Museum, I'm just going to keep bringing up the British Museum.
Drag them. Yeah.
Let's just drag them through the dirt. The British Museum is wonderful if you've never been there. It's really, really big. But what was I saying? Buying that reproduction, is that art, or is this just function for your stupid wall? Is it the same? Is it exactly the same? Or is it completely different? I don't know if there's an answer, but...
No, because it reminds me, like, this being our dessert, and so, like, that final flavor of, like, this defining lines of, like, how you choose to define yourself. Because I think, like, I look at it in two different perspectives of, like, would I have this in my apartment? And knowing me, where it's, like, pinch every penny and everything's got to do more than one thing or whatever, it's like, I might, if this was, like, the Winged Victory or some other famous statue, but also like, hey, check this out. And there's the, that's where I keep the DVD player or whatever is in there. It's like, okay, that's kind of interesting. But then it reminds me, there's like, I think this is something you go through in your 20s when it comes to like romantic partners of like, you reach puberty and you find the opposite sex generally attractive, and then you hit about 18, 19, 20, and you have the things that like you consciously know of that you want, and then in your 20s you're like, oh, here are things I didn't know that I have a preference for or a aversion to. And one of mine has been like, you go back and you're like, what's the common denominator behind a lot of these people, like the reasons for which what kinds of art they buy for their spaces or places or clothes they wear, and like for what reason. And I think of like one of my exes in particular, loved her to death because like her sense of style was insanely unique, and like she did not care, and she was just presenting herself to the world.
Yeah.
And I felt that was very authentic. And then another one would buy these pretty things that represented like paintings or whatever, that represented on a very superficial level her interests. And
I know art.
Yes. And it's not even in like the super cultured way of like, oh, I'm very, whatever, but it's like, this speaks to me because this is about this. And it's like, okay, if that's about that, then this is like, not to use the kids word, #problematic, but like, okay, you're not African American, so careful here. Like, this is an interesting thing to depict as being a part of who you are. And I think like my in looking at this dish on the menu here when you brought it, was like, normally I would have a problem with this sort of thing because it's too hat on top of a hat of like, it's like this pre-existing work of art, but you've never seen me do it. And it's like, well, who are you? And I think it gets a pass for me because it's Salvador Dali. Yeah. And he's done Persistence of Memory at that. Yeah, Persistence of Memory, which is the famous like clocks melting painting. And he's known now as this eccentric, interesting person in the 20s and 30s when it's more artistically valid to be eccentric and weird for the sake of weirdness.
Totally, yeah.
And so, like, him doing this, it's an interesting... because what is his take on the piece?
Well, interesting. Because, I don't know. I'm torn. Like, sometimes I am generally interested to know what the artist thinks of their piece. But on the same hand... or on the different hand, I guess you would say. One of my favorite filmmakers is David Lynch. And David Lynch, if you've never watched any of his films, most of them are very avant-garde. They don't make a hell of a lot of sense sometimes. Eraserhead, one of my favorite films of all time, doesn't necessarily make sense from beginning to end. But he has always said that he refuses to like explain anything happening in any of his films, right? Like he doesn't have director's commentaries on any of his on any of the DVDs or Blu-rays. On interviews, he just refuses to talk about. He'll talk about some like, here's how I made a couple of these scenes, but I don't really care to explain what's going on. And I kind of like that. Yeah. But Dali was not one of those people. Dali talked about what his works meant to him. And according to him, so he says it was created wholly for the purpose of materializing in a fetishistic way with maximum tangible reality, ideas and fantasies of a delirious character. He was apparently influenced by Sigmund Freud, and one analysis calls it the culmination of his explorations into the deep psychological mysteries of sexual desire. Also, it was apparently a pun. Chest of drawers.
Okay. I'm back. I'm in it. Okay. Because at first I was like, I don't know about all that. Like, I agree with some of that, but apparently, yeah, if he's after the puns. That's interesting because I see the Freudian side of that for sure.
Yeah, like, okay, it's Aphrodite, Greek goddess of love, and drawers, you keep things hidden in them. But another one that I was reading, just like there's any, there's like 6 million news websites that will tear apart any piece of news and put their take on it. There's the same thing for the art world. And one of the blogs that I was reading says, in simple terminology, Dali wanted people to open up and confront their deepest fears, desires, as well as any subconscious troubles they may be facing before facing their death.
Death. Okay.
I don't know if it does.
Death is, yeah. I'm not quite. Yeah, because I guess drilling into the heart of. Well, we don't need to drill. We can just open the drawer. I guess drilling into the heart of the matter in this like meal. Like one of the big problems I have with like, I say modern society, and that can mean the last 12 months or last 12 years or 120 years or whatever, is like the exterior ways in which people choose to identify themselves, and like the extent to which, like if your soul or your core is like a pie chart, and how much of that is like internally grown versus like externally imposed, but you sort of conflate the two. Yeah. So I'm a average white 20-something whatever, so I like The Office and Marvel movies and Taylor Swift. And then someone like, oh, I don't know, the bass or treble chef comes along and says like, well, I don't know about Marvel movies or Taylor Swift or The Office. And there's this weird, it's called identity protective cognition is one of the, like, as a very short example, if I am raised, my favorite color are like blue. Blue is associated with my childhood, and then I meet my girlfriend to some shade of blue, and then we get married in a blue wedding, and I have a blue job.
You meet a girlfriend inside of a shade of blue.
I just realized I was describing that Eiffel 65, so like I'm blue. So let me do this a different way. Let's say
with
America,
a blue little window and a blue Corvette.
Thank you. Let's strip it back even further. So like New York. If I live in New York, and that's where I experienced the happiness of my childhood, and then I meet my future wife in New York, and then my job is New York based, and blah, 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 blah. If it comes out that all of a sudden, for some reason, New York is actually built on a Native American burial ground, and it's full of white supremacists who actually helped the Nazis, and blah, 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 blah. Like the extent that you're going to poison the New York name, this is why people will like fight it of like, no, because then my entire identity is wrapped up. If I don't have New York, I lose my wife, I lose my job, I lose my everything. And this like defining lines of like what you choose to identify yourself as, I feel that it's becoming a more pervasive, like we just talked about minimalism. And I'm such a minimalist, and I love, I'm not into material possessions. I'm into a minimalist, but then I'm a minimalist. But then, like you say, so what do you have in your house, in your apartment, whatever? It's like, well, selective objects that all cost a lot of money that I replace yearly. And it's like, but I'm not a consumer. I'm not like a mindless whatever. And in the same way, I am like the one of these stands that I will forever take is like Kanye West of like, I was there at the ground floor, some little white kid out in the plains, basically, of like, this guy's amazing and everything he does is great. And then George Bush doesn't care about black people. And I'm like, he's right. Don't get mad at him, and all these other sorts of things until the Life of Pablo, whenever. And then people are saying, and then especially albums after that of like, oh, he's insane, he's crazy, and he's this and that and this and that. And there was this point at which maybe it just comes with some degree of maturity or facing some sort of tangible change in the things that you like. It was like, well, I don't need to staunchly defend Kanye as I once did with like Yeezus or things like that, because he is his own person and he is his own thing. I enjoy his work quite a bit, but I enjoy his work on a very individual, subjective level. And I guess would just ask you the question with like, we're talking defining lines, and you have FK Twigs, who, like anyone, like a David Bowie, can choose to do whatever kind of music she wants. And like you say, am I having this reaction to her work because I want her to be this other thing, or because it's objectively not good? And then same with The Matrix, almost exactly, where The Matrix is this very singular, very unique thing. And then are people reacting because they can't see the movie in front of them, or are they attached, rightfully so, because they're being led a bill of sale of this is a Matrix movie. When it comes to, I guess, a relationship between, not to blow it up to a gigantic question, but just your general thoughts on like, any human being is moving through culture and through art. You choose to be affected by these things, and they leave an imprint on you. But then how much is too much of an imprint to where like that is literally not your identity? That is the Taylor Swift 1989 album. Like, you're not her friend. You like her music. Like, there doesn't need to be this team associative identity that comes with it.
It is interesting, right? Because both likes and dislikes have kind of become this way. In that, if you are this certain kind of person, you are supposed to like this, but you're not supposed to like that. And, as someone who generally doesn't enjoy, like top 40 pop music, and has, I guess I would just say slightly more eccentric tastes. Some would call me a hipster. And so as now that is my identity according to society, I am supposed to love Neutral Milk Hotel to death. And I am supposed to love Animal Collective. And like, I am supposed to do these things and wear these things and be this person. And dislike these things and not wear these things, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And it's really, really interesting because it's like anything. It's like being a part of any sort of, I guess what I would call in the larger scale, like an ism, right?
Yeah.
So Dali is a surreal, in the field of surrealism, but Venus de Milo is a work of classicism, a classic work. And so we have to draw these distinctions because, this is part of this ism, so it's got to be, it has to be this thing. Or on like a really, really macro scale, like I listen to a lot of metal, and there's like, this is brutal death metal, but this album is actually melodic death metal. But no, not quite. This one's more technical death metal. And like these kind of things, every time that you try to draw one of those defining lines, make a new ism per se, like the reasons for it are relatively laudable, right? Like if I like the sound of this melodic death metal album, therefore I would try to search out other things that are called melodic death metal. Or if I consider myself like a goth, then I look this certain way in order to find the people who are similar to me in certain kinds of ways so I can find my community. Therefore, this helps me out in some sort of way. But if you draw those lines too thickly, I suppose, if you define them too if you define them to such a level, I feel like it really, really holds you back as a human. And that's why I try to avoid any of those isms whenever humanly possible.
But for some reason, if that just didn't do it for you, also on the menu this month, Kinoteki put out Human Mind. This relatively unknown and obscure artist actually put out a nice little album that you can use as an introduction to all sorts of electronic music as a kind of sampler platter.
Boy Harsher, The Runner. Released with an accompanied 40-minute short film, the latest from one of the most prominent voices in the contemporary darkwave scene, explores some old sounds and some new territory in their latest full length.
Silvana Estrada put out Marchita. Estrada crafts such a wonderful, delicate, and proud tapestry in her latest album that it's impossible not to feel warmed and soothed by it.
Anna von Hauswolf, live at Montreux Jazz Festival. It's rare that live albums are worth listening to, and super rare they are actually better than an artist's studio albums. But that might just be the case with this recording of the Swedish songwriter's 2018 performance at Montreux. The atmosphere is stunning, and her voice even more so. It might, 1 month into this long year, be my current album of the year.
Oh, wow. That's pretty good this early. You can listen to all of those, dear diners, at our Spotify playlist, A Minor Diner Dishes, where we feature anything that's ever been also on the menu, as well as any dish that we've ever served.
So we always have a question. We gotta go back to the.
Yeah, we can't do that out here in front of the simpletons. We gotta go back to the kitchen for this one.
Yeah, let's go back there. So we, as I was starting to say to the simpletons, we have a question that we ask you diners every month, and we love to hear your answers. Last month's question was, what work makes you feel on top of the world? So what brings you the most amount of joy humanly possible?
Drew from Denver said the second to last track on E.T. the Extraterrestrials soundtrack, called Escape/Chase/Saying Goodbye, gives me chills. Makes me want to run, cry, scream, laugh hysterically, and then cry again. It's exactly 15 minutes long and encapsulates each of John Williams' genius themes for the movie into one hair-raising, heart-pounding finale. I want this song to be played at my funeral.
Wow.
Yeah, that is a absolutely fantastic track. And when Drew from Denver comes back and gets his giant statue off of our patio.
Yeah, eventually.
Yes. He actually has a very wonderful story about his relationship with this particular track. So I could see him. I'm glad to get this note.
It's got me thinking what songs I want played at my funeral. And I think Guillotine by Death Grips.
Well, it is very interesting you say that, because I would argue the thing that makes me feel on top of the world, we spoke earlier about mixtapes. When Death Grips put out Ex-Military, both at the time and even now, 10 years later, I just get my heartbeat jumps up 60 beats per minute.
Yep.
And it's just an exciting, we're doing this, we can do crazy things where it starts with Manson and then goes into all sorts of other samples, and just so fresh and innovative.
It is.
What would you say? What makes you feel on top of the world?
That's super hard because especially last month during our meal du mois, we featured two of the dishes that would actually come to mind, like DJ Sabrina the Teenage DJ's albums and House, one of my favorite movies. So kind of makes me think live shows, I guess, concerts. The best sets kind of bring me this almost otherworldly, above myself kind of joy. Seeing God in the mosh pit per se. Some of the ones that did that this last year, also on the menu this month, was Boy Harsher. I saw them last year, and they destroyed. George Clanton, Kikagaku Moyo, all sorts of good stuff.
Oh, nice. Yeah, like you say, we've talked about it before. It's a very nice communal, almost religious experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we love hearing from our patrons and like to bring some kind of thought-provoking questions for us and the chefs back here. So after this meal, we want to know what piece of art best defines you.
So if you were to present a piece of art as you, per se, what would be your best choice? All right. You can write into us in one of numerous ways. You can go to aminordiner@gmail.com, send us through the email, or go to Instagram, Facebook, comment on our YouTube page or this YouTube video. You can now also send a 30-second to 1-minute audio answer to aminordiner@gmail.com.
Well, it's been a good time, everybody, but it is getting late. Thank you for dining with us tonight. Be sure to thank your hostess, Miss Mandy Groves, on your way out, and wave to Edward Tart on keys, killing it as always. A Minor Diner is recorded on location and produced by Epicene Motion Picture Company. We'll see you next time, everyone.
Goodbye.